The Consciousness Code Podcast, Episode 19, Reclaiming Yourself from Autopilot, How to Catch the Loop Before It Becomes You. Hello, and welcome back to the Consciousness Code Podcast. In the last episode, we explored collective conscious states. We looked at how consciousness scales beyond the individual, how groups generate emotional climates, how belonging alters perception, how fear and righteousness amplify certainty, and how collective attention can make prominence feel like truth. We examined the comfort of the crowd, the seduction of shared distortion, and the difficult but necessary task of remaining human inside group energy. And if that episode widened the inquiry outward, into atmosphere, ideology, crowd psychology, and collective fields, then this episode turns the lens inward again, but not in a way that forgets everything we have already seen. Because once you understand how body, language, relationship, and group energy shape consciousness, the next question becomes intensely practical. Not only what influences us, but also how those influences become patterns. Not only how awareness is shaped from outside, but also how automatic loops continue running inside daily life long after the original trigger has passed. That is where we move now, into autopilot, into the ordinary but profound fact that much of human life is lived through repetitions that become so familiar they stop looking like patterns at all. A person wakes into the same emotional state before the day has properly begun, reaches for the phone before they have consciously chosen to, feels themselves becoming the same version of themselves in the same kind of argument, repeats a tone, posture, story, reaction, or collapse they thought they had already grown beyond, says the same thing, explains the same wound, defends in the same way, disappears in the same place, and only realizes halfway through that the loop is running again. This is where the work becomes less theoretical and more intimate, because conscious change does not begin with mastery. It begins with noticing. It begins with catching the pattern before it has fully taken the wheel. It begins in the moment you realize this is happening again. Not after the perfect transformation, not once the behavior is gone forever, not when you become some permanently self-aware version of yourself, untouched by history, trigger, or repetition. Awareness starts when the loop becomes visible. Reclaiming yourself begins when automaticity is noticed. So this episode is about practical recognition, about learning how loops begin, about why insight alone does not stop repetition, about why it is so easy to understand yourself in calm states and then vanish into old patterns the moment pressure arrives. It is about recognizing bodily signs, emotional beginnings, familiar mental scripts, behavioral microhabits, and those almost invisible moments where a pattern starts gathering force. Most importantly, it is about learning how to interrupt without turning the interruption into another performance of self-attack. Because the point is not to become perfect. The point is to notice earlier. The point is to reclaim the moment before reaction becomes total. That is where we begin now. With the first and most practical truth of all, awareness begins where automaticity is noticed. Part 1. Awareness begins where automaticity is noticed. There is a very specific kind of moment most people know well, even if they do not always catch it in time. You are halfway through an argument and suddenly realize that the same script is running again. The same tone, the same defensiveness, the same need to explain yourself in the same way. Or maybe it is quieter than that. You pick up your phone without having consciously decided to. You open an app, then another, and only several minutes later realize that you were not exactly choosing any of them. Or perhaps it happens first thing in the morning. You wake into an old emotional state before the day has even begun properly. The body is already carrying dread, heaviness, urgency, shame, or some familiar low-grade fog before your conscious mind has formed a clear thought. Or maybe it appears relationally, a small cue in someone's voice, a facial expression, a pause, a delayed reply, and suddenly you are no longer fully in the present. You are in the old role, the opposer, the explainer, the withdrawer, the attacker, the one who goes cold, the one who disappears, the one who tries to restore safety by becoming useful, agreeable, invisible, or righteous. These moments matter because they reveal something essential about consciousness. Much of life is organized through loops that are already moving before reflection has caught up. People often imagine change in dramatic terms. They think transformation means the pattern is gone, the habit is broken, and the reaction no longer appears. But in lived reality, conscious change often begins much earlier and much more humbly than that. It begins when the pattern becomes noticeable. It begins when automaticity becomes visible from within, rather than only obvious in hindsight. That is a crucial distinction. Many people only recognize their loops afterwards. After the argument, after the scrolling, after the collapse, after the over-explaining, after the day has been shaped by a mood they never fully interrupted. Afterwards, the person looks back and says, I did it again. And sometimes even that after-the-fact recognition is meaningful, because for a long time, many people are not even that conscious. They simply live the loop as life itself. But awareness deepens the earlier it arrives. The earlier the pattern becomes visible, the less total it becomes. This is why awareness starts not when the pattern is gone, but when it can be seen. That matters because many people use an impossible standard without realizing it. They assume they are only becoming conscious if they no longer react, no longer drift, no longer repeat, no longer vanish into old emotional architecture. But that standard turns consciousness into fantasy. Human beings are patterned creatures. Their nervous systems move quickly. Their histories live in the body. Their attention is vulnerable to capture. Their identities are built through repetition. So, expecting that awareness must mean permanent immunity only creates discouragement. A more honest standard is this. Can you notice the loop sooner than before? Can you see it while it is happening? Not only after it has reorganized the whole hour, day, or relationship. Can you become less identical with it in real time? That is the doorway. Because reclaiming yourself begins with catching repetition sooner. Imagine somebody in the middle of a conversation with a partner or friend. The topic turns slightly difficult. There is a pause, a shift in tone, a small facial change. Suddenly, the person feels that old internal acceleration. They want to explain everything at once. They want to prove they are not wrong. Or they feel the opposite. They want to leave internally, become cold, give minimal answers, and stop being contactable. If they do not notice this early, the whole loop may unfold before they recognize it. But if somewhere in the middle they realize, my system has already started moving, that changes the event. The pattern may still run partly. The reaction may not disappear. But something else has entered the field now, observation. They are no longer only the loop. They are also the one who sees it. That is not a small difference. The same thing applies in digital life. A person reaches for stimulation because silence feels vaguely uncomfortable, or because a task has become difficult, or because the body wants relief from contact with the present. They unlock the phone, scroll, check, refresh, click, reopen. 10 minutes later, they realize they were never fully deciding. They were being carried. Again, awareness does not begin only when they stop doing this forever. It begins the moment they can catch the movement. Ah, I am reaching again. The urge is here. Something in me does not want to stay with the discomfort of this moment. That recognition is the first interruption. Or think about mornings. This is one of the most revealing places to study autopilot, because morning states often arrive before the conscious narrative has fully formed. A person wakes and the body is already in an old climate, tension, heaviness, anticipatory shame, urgency, emotional flatness. They may not yet have a clear story, but the state is there. Without awareness, the entire day may then be organized around that unexamined beginning. The person will think, speak, and interpret from it while assuming it is simply how today feels. But if they catch it early, not with judgment, but with recognition, something shifts. They may still feel the state, but they are less likely to confuse it entirely with reality. They begin the day with one extra degree of freedom. This is why the opening truth of this episode is so practical. Most people live much of life in loops they only notice afterwards. Awareness begins not when the loop has vanished, but when it becomes visible. Reclaiming yourself means learning to catch repetition before it fully hardens into destiny. And once that is understood, the next challenge appears immediately. Because just notice it sounds simple, but in practice, it is not. Patterns hide inside familiarity. They feel like a personality. They feel like realism. They feel like mood, instinct, or common sense. Once a loop is underway, it often feels less like repetition and more like reality itself. Which means the next thing we need to examine is why recognition is so much harder than it sounds. That is where we move next. Part 2. Why recognition is harder than it sounds. If the first part of this episode established that awareness begins where automaticity is noticed, then the next thing we have to face is why that noticing is so much harder than people tend to assume. Because just notice it sounds simple when said from a distance. It sounds like a small instruction, a clean psychological suggestion. Pay attention, become aware, catch the loop. But in lived reality, recognition is often one of the hardest parts of change. Why? Because automation is designed to feel natural from the inside. That is the core problem. Patterns do not usually arrive wearing labels. They do not announce themselves as old loops, protective adaptations, or rehearsed nervous system sequences. They arrive as you, as your mood, your preference, your instinct, your way of thinking, your taste, your temperament, your personality, your standards, your realism. This is just how I am. And because they arrive wearing the clothing of selfhood, they are difficult to question. People often do not experience the pattern as a pattern. They experience it as identity. This is where a useful distinction has to be made early, because without it, people either become too rigid or too vague in how they understand themselves. Personality is not the same thing as pattern. Character is not the same thing as conditioning. Identity is not the same thing as truth. Those things overlap, but they are not identical. Psychologically, personality usually refers to relatively enduring tendencies in how a person thinks, feels, relates, and behaves. You might say someone is more introverted, more open, more conscientious, more emotionally sensitive, more novelty-seeking, more orderly, more reserved, or more expressive. Personality in this sense is partly temperamental. It has continuity. It gives shape to style. It is not inherently a problem. It is part of how an individual moves through the world. But the pattern is different. A pattern is a repeated sequence that has often been learned, reinforced, or adapted over time. It may involve body state, expectation, emotional reaction, interpretation, and behavior. A pattern can become so stable that it starts looking like personality, but it may in fact be an adaptation. For example, someone may say, I'm just not a people person, when what is actually happening is that repeated relational disappointment has conditioned withdrawal. Or someone may say, I'm a naturally intense person, when part of what they mean is that their nervous system has been trained into chronic urgency and hyperactivation. Or someone may say, I'm just very independent, when some of that independence is actually a defensive adaptation against relying on others. That does not make the person fake. It means the style and the strategy have fused. Character adds another layer. Philosophically and ethically, character is often understood as the pattern of qualities a person repeatedly embodies through action. Honesty, courage, restraint, generosity, cruelty, cowardice, integrity, responsibility, loyalty, vanity, and so on. Character in this sense is less about temperament and more about the moral texture of how a person lives. It has to do with what they practice, what they repeat, and what they choose when alternatives are available. Character is not fixed once and for all, but neither is it trivial. It is shaped by habits, environment, memory, values, and repeated action. Someone can have a warm personality and a weak character. Someone can have a difficult personality and a strong character. The categories are not interchangeable. Then there is identity. Psychologically, identity is the organized sense of who one takes oneself to be. It is built through story, role, memory, belonging, language, and repeated meaning. I am the one who. I'm not the kind of person who. In my family, I was always. People like me. Identity gives continuity. It helps life feel coherent. But identity is also highly vulnerable to repetition, social reinforcement, and emotional atmosphere. It can become built from wounded patterning, just as easily as from mature self-knowledge. From a more philosophical perspective, identity is also the narrative thread the self uses to remain recognizable over time. It is not necessarily false, but it is always interpreted. It is always partly composed. It is the story through which continuity is maintained. From a spiritual perspective, many traditions would make another distinction still, between the constructed self and something deeper. They might say identity, personality, and character all matter, but none of them fully exhaust what a person is. There is also awareness itself, presence itself, the witnessing capacity beneath roles and habits. Some would call that consciousness, spirit, soul, witnessing mind, Buddha nature, essence, or the deeper self. The vocabulary differs, but the core idea is similar. What you habitually call me may include many layers, and not all of them are equally fundamental. From a more pathological or clinical perspective, we would add yet another warning. Some things that feel deeply personal may be shaped by trauma adaptation, attachment injury, chronic stress, unresolved grief, obsessive loops, depressive thinking, compulsive self-protection, or long-standing threat conditioning. In these cases, the person is not inventing their experience. The experience is real, but the form it takes may reflect a pattern response rather than a stable truth about who they are. Why does all this matter here? One of the main reasons recognition is so difficult is that people keep confusing what is familiar with what is essential. If something has been with you for years, it starts feeling like you. If a reaction comes quickly enough, it starts feeling natural. If a role has kept you safe long enough, it starts feeling like an identity. If a defensive style has worked often enough, it starts feeling like character. If a nervous system pattern keeps repeating, it starts feeling like personality. And that is exactly why just notice it is not simple advice. Patterns hide in familiarity. This is one of the most important truths in the entire episode. The human system is built to normalize what repeats. That is how adaptation works. The repeated becomes predictable. The predictable becomes efficient. The efficient becomes invisible. And once something becomes invisible, it stops feeling like a process and starts feeling like reality. A person raised in a house where low-grade tension was constant may later experience tension as normal intimacy. A person who had to become hyper-competent early may later call themselves driven, without fully recognizing the fear beneath the drive. A person repeatedly ignored in moments of need may later describe themselves as someone who doesn't need much, without realizing how much adaptation has been mistaken for preference. Old adaptations can feel normal even when they are painful. This is one of the strange difficulties of growth. People often suffer through patterns they no longer consciously choose, but because the patterns are familiar, they remain recognizable as self. The person may hate the outcome while still identifying with the sequence. This always happens. That's just how I react. I know what I'm like. In many cases, what they are calling self-knowledge is partly loop loyalty, and that loop loyalty remains even in intelligent people. That point deserves emphasis because many people still secretly imagine that enough insight, education, or intelligence should protect them from automaticity. It does not. Intelligence can describe a loop brilliantly while still being carried by it. A highly articulate person may understand their attachment dynamics, their family history, their nervous system style, and their triggers in exquisite detail, and still disappear into the same reaction the moment activation rises. Why? Because autopilot is not primarily defeated by explanation. It is interrupted through earlier awareness, embodied literacy, and repeated return. Insight gained in calm states often disappears under pressure. That is not hypocrisy. It is state dependence. When the system is regulated, spacious, and reflective, a person can see a great deal. They understand their behavior. They promise themselves they will respond differently next time. They feel clear, but then pressure arrives. A conflict cue, a familiar tone, a morning wave of dread, a message not replied to, a social exclusion signal, fatigue, shame, threat. Suddenly, the body is moving before reflection has fully returned. The nervous system becomes faster than the insight. The old adaptation comes online because it is still more rehearsed than the newer awareness. This is why a person may genuinely, know better, and still repeat. The newer insight is real, but the older sequence is faster. And once a loop is underway, it often feels like reality, not repetition. This is another key difficulty. In the middle of the loop, the person does not usually think, "Ah, yes, my familiar shame defense urgency pattern is currently unfolding." They think, "This is what's happening." The interpretation feels immediate, justified, obvious, and alive. The body is already activated. The emotional state is already shaping salience. The mind begins explaining from inside the activation. That explanation feels true because it arises in real time, which is why people often only recognize the loop after they have already acted. After the argument, they see the pattern. After the scrolling binge, they see the avoidance. After the collapse, they see the old story. After they have over-explained, withdrawn, numbed, attacked, or performed, they recognize what was happening. And unfortunately, this is also the point where many people make another mistake. They confuse recognition with self-criticism. They see the loop and immediately attack themselves for it. "I've done it again. I should be past this. What is wrong with me? I know all this stuff, so why am I still like this? I'm failing. I'm fake. I'm just repeating the same nonsense." But this response often deepens the loop instead of interrupting it. Why? Because self-attack is not the same as awareness. Shame is not clarity. Condemnation may feel like honesty because it is harsh, but harshness often reduces the very conditions needed for real observation. The person becomes less able to see because they are now defending themselves. This is especially important when the pattern itself already carries shame. If a person's adaptation is to freeze, appease, avoid, collapse, overthink, self-monitor, or disappear, then adding self-criticism afterwards often teaches the system that recognition itself is dangerous. The mind learns, if I see the pattern, I get punished. That does not make noticing easier next time. It makes it harder. So part of why recognition is difficult is not only that automation feels natural from the inside, it is also that many people have paired awareness with self-attack, which means the system has little reason to welcome early noticing. Early noticing becomes associated with humiliation rather than relief. A more mature form of recognition sounds different. It says, "This is familiar. My system has started moving. Something old is happening here. This feels real, but it may also be patterned. I do not need to hate myself to see this clearly." That kind of recognition creates space instead of collapse. This brings us back to the central insight of the section. Recognition is difficult because automation is designed to feel natural from the inside. It hides in familiarity. It wears the face of personality. It borrows the language of identity. It recruits the body before reflection. It becomes harder to see under pressure. And once it is running, it feels like reality itself, which means awareness work has to become more precise, more compassionate, and more embodied than simply telling people to notice. They need to know what to notice. They need to learn the earliest markers, the first bodily shift, the first tone change, the first emotional contraction, the first urge to flee, fix, explain, disappear, check out, or reach for stimulation, because the loop can often be caught earlier than people think, if they know where to look. That is where we move next. Part 3. The earliest signs of a loop if recognition is difficult. Because automation feels natural from the inside, then the next practical question is obvious. What do you actually look for? Because if people wait until the pattern is fully formed, they are often already deep inside it. The argument is already underway. The phone is already in the hand. The withdrawal is already happening. The tone has already changed. The whole field has already narrowed. By that point, awareness still matters, but the interruption will usually be harder because the loop already has momentum. So this part of the episode is about catching the earliest signs, the small movements, the bodily cues, the emotional beginnings, the familiar mental phrases, the behavioral microshifts, the energetic changes that happen before the person has fully disappeared into the pattern. Because often the loop can be caught in the body before it is caught in language. That is the core insight. Most people try to recognize patterns at the level of explanation first. They ask, "What am I telling myself?" Or, "What does this mean?" Those questions matter, but by the time the mind is asking them clearly, a great deal may already be underway. The body is often earlier. The nervous system shifts before the narrative becomes articulate. The organism begins preparing before the personality has finished explaining itself. So if you want to catch a loop in real time, you often need to become literate in what the body does first. Start with bodily shifts. One of the most common early signs is the jaw. People often do not realize how quickly the jaw tightens when a loop begins. The person receives a message, hears a tone, senses a relational cue, thinks about a task they are avoiding, or wakes into an old climate. And before any clear story has formed, the jaw has already changed. It becomes harder, more locked, less available. That may seem minor, but it is often a first signal that the system is moving toward defense, control, or bracing. The breath is another early marker. It shortens, speeds up, moves higher into the chest, gets held, becomes less available as a point of contact. A person may not consciously feel stressed yet, but the breath is already telling the truth. The system has moved from openness to preparation. If the person can notice that early, they gain information before the loop becomes total. Shoulder lifting is another one. So common, so physical, and so often ignored. The shoulders rise, not because the person consciously chooses tension, but because the body is preparing to hold something, defend something, or move into readiness. The stomach hardens, the chest narrows, the brow tightens, the skin becomes slightly hot or cold, the limbs feel more restless or heavier. These are not random. There are changes in the conditions of consciousness itself. This is why morning dread is such a good example. Many people wake into a state before they wake into a thought. Their eyes open, and the day already feels difficult. The stomach is hard, the chest is tight, the body does not want to move. Or the opposite, the body is already slightly activated, already leaning toward urgency, already mentally scanning. At this stage, the person may not yet have a coherent explanation. They may only know, something is wrong, or I already don't want today, or I feel behind before I've begun. This is one of the clearest examples of a loop starting beneath language. If the person waits for a perfect interpretation, they may already lose the morning. But if they catch the state as state, my body has already entered the old climate. They have interrupted something important. Not solved it, but seen it. Then there are the emotional beginnings. Loops often begin as very small emotional movements that quickly recruit the rest of the system. Irritation. A tiny flash of defensiveness. A wave of collapse. A pulse of shame. A low-grade numbness. A sense of urgency that arrives faster than the situation seems to justify. These beginnings matter because they are often easier to notice than the full emotional state that follows. Take irritation. Many people think of irritation as a simple feeling, but in loops, it is often an early threshold emotion. It may be the first sign that the person is moving toward anger, overwhelm, or defensive closure. A message arrives from a certain person, and the body instantly becomes slightly irritated. Immediately feels the drop. Energy goes down, the self gets smaller, motivation evaporates, the person starts thinking in terms of what's the point, or I can't deal with this. The collapse may later become numbness, avoidance, or self-attack, but if it is seen early as an emotional beginning rather than a total truth, that changes the relationship. Urgency is another major marker. Many loops begin with the feeling that something must be fixed now, explained now, decided now, responded to now, solved now. Urgency is powerful because it often disguises itself as responsibility or clarity, but sometimes it is simply activation. A person gets a text and instantly feels they must reply in exactly the right way. They feel a tension in a relationship and believe they must talk immediately before they can rest. They notice discomfort in themselves and become desperate to get rid of it. Urgency can be one of the clearest signs that the loop is beginning. Then there are the mental signs. By the time thought becomes noticeable, the body and emotional field may already have moved, but the mental layer still gives valuable clues. Familiar internal phrases are one of the easiest to track. The same explanations begin appearing. Here we go again, they always do this, I've messed it up, and no one understands me. I need to sort this right now. It's hopeless, I can't let this go. They must think. This always happens. These are not merely thoughts, they are often signatures of specific loops. Once the familiar phrase appears, the pattern is often already recruiting the person into its old architecture. Repetitive explanation is another clue. When the mind begins telling the same story again and again, especially in slightly different forms, it is often trying to stabilize a state rather than illuminate reality. The person keeps proving the same point to themselves, keeps rehearsing the same grievance, keeps defending the same interpretation, keeps turning the same interaction over and over. That repetition can feel like thinking, but often it is looping. Binary thinking is another early marker. The field narrows into this or that, all or nothing, safe or dangerous, accepted or rejected, good or bad, success or failure. Complexity begins to disappear. The person's interpretive world shrinks. Once you notice binary thinking arriving quickly, it is often a sign that the loop has moved from open awareness into pattern protection. Behavioral signs are just as important because some loops reveal themselves not in what a person thinks, but in what they suddenly start doing. Checking out is a major one. The conversation becomes less emotionally available. The eyes glaze slightly. The responses become thinner. The person is still present, but not fully. They have withdrawn inwardly before the conversation has outwardly ended. This is often the earliest sign of a shutdown or flight pattern. Over-explaining is another. A person begins using too many words. They repeat themselves. They try to manage how they are being received. They keep clarifying beyond what the moment actually requires. Over-explaining often means the nervous system is already trying to secure safety through language. Reaching for the phone is one of the most obvious modern loop signals. Not because phones are inherently bad, but because many people now regulate discomfort by defaulting into stimulation. The moment a task gets hard, a feeling rises, a silence appears, or the body loses ease, the hand moves. Not always consciously. That movement itself is data. The urge to check, scroll, refresh, look, escape. This is often the behavioral beginning of a loop. Wanting to fix is another early marker. Some people do not flee discomfort by withdrawing. They flee it by organizing, explaining, helping, resolving, or pushing for closure. The moment the field becomes uncertain, they start moving toward a solution. Again, on the surface, this may look mature or competent, but sometimes it is just the loop, a way of escaping the difficulty of remaining with what has not yet settled. Wanting to flee is the complementary pattern. Leave the room, end the conversation, shut the laptop, stop replying, go numb, distract, disappear. These are not always wrong choices. Sometimes leaving is wise. But as an early marker, the sudden urge to get out can tell you that the body has already started preparing for autopilot. Then there are energetic signs, which many people feel but do not always trust. Narrowing is one of the clearest. The world gets smaller, the mind gets smaller, the range of what seems possible gets smaller. The person begins inhabiting a tighter version of themselves. Speeding up is another. Not only physical movement but inner tempo. Thoughts get faster, speech gets sharper. The body wants to move ahead of itself. Going flat is different. The color drains, interest drops. The world becomes grey, inert, inaccessible. Going foggy is another. Everything gets slightly harder to organize. The person becomes less sure what they feel, but not in an open way, in a dimmed way. Becoming performative is one of the most important energetic signs of all. The person stops speaking from presence and starts speaking from role. The helpful one, the calm one, the clever one, the detached one, the strong one, the compliant one. Performance often means the real self is already being replaced by adaptation. Consider the small relational cue that starts a whole loop. Someone you care about replies with a shorter message than usual, or they seem distant for a moment, or they pause in a way that the body interprets quickly. Before any full story forms, your stomach tightens, breath changes, urgency appears. The mind starts generating an explanation. They're upset, I did something wrong, they're pulling away, I need to fix this. That is how fast the loop can start. Not with the whole narrative, but with a tiny cue met by an old pattern. If caught early, the person may say, my system has already moved. If not, the whole evening may be swallowed by reaction. Or think about the first sign you are about to spiral online. Maybe it is not the actual scrolling yet. Maybe it is the moment after a trigger when your attention starts narrowing and your hand wants the phone. Maybe it is the tiny charge in the body that says, I need to see if anyone else is saying this, or I need to check, or I need stimulation. On noticing the jaw, the stomach, the breath, the urgency, the tone shift, the hand moving toward the phone, the performative self coming online, the field narrowing. If the person can learn those signs, they stop waiting until the loop has fully become a worldview. And once those signs are seen, another crucial question emerges. What do you do next without turning recognition into punishment? Because many people do manage to catch the pattern, only to immediately shame themselves for it. That does not interrupt the loop. It usually strengthens it. That is where we move next. Part 4. How to interrupt without shaming yourself once a person begins seeing the loop earlier. The next danger appears almost immediately. They turn the recognition into another weapon against themselves. They notice the pattern and instantly collapse into self-attack. Here we go again. I've done it again. What is wrong with me? I should be past this by now. I know better than this. This is ridiculous. I'm failing again. This is one of the most common and least helpful responses in consciousness work, because it feels like honesty while actually deepening the very pattern the person is trying to interrupt. It feels sharp, real, uncompromising, mature. But often it is just shame re-entering the loop in a different outfit. Shame strengthens loops. That is one of the most important truths in this whole part. Shame narrows awareness. It does not widen it. It makes the person smaller, more defended, more collapsed, and more identified with the pattern they have just noticed. Instead of creating room between the self and the loop, shame fuses them more tightly. The person is no longer saying, a pattern is happening in me. They are saying, this pattern is me. This failure is mine. This collapse is me. That fusion is exactly what interruption is supposed to loosen. This is why I've done it again, so often deepens the collapse. On the surface, it sounds like recognition. But depending on the tone and state it comes from, it is often not real recognition at all. It is an accusation. It is the old hostile atmosphere returning. It is the internal punisher stepping in and calling that punishment awareness. The person sees the pattern, yes, but instead of gaining distance from it, they are immediately swallowed by a second loop, the loop of self-condemnation. That second loop often feels morally satisfying because it gives the illusion of accountability. It says, at least I'm not deluding myself. At least I'm being hard on myself because I care. But harshness is not the same as clarity. In many cases, it is simply the familiar internal climate of shame-based control. It does not create new possibilities. It recreates the old atmosphere in which the person has already learned to disappear. This is why the difference between recognition and self-attack matters so much. Recognition says, something is happening. Self-attack says, something is wrong with me. Recognition says, this feels familiar. Self-attack says, I am pathetic for still doing this. Recognition says, my system has started moving. Self-attack says, I should be beyond this by now. Recognition observes the loop. Self-attack becomes another layer of it. That distinction is subtle, but decisive. A person can notice the same behavior in two completely different ways. They can say, I'm over-explaining right now because I'm not feeling safe. Or they can say, I'm doing that pathetic thing again where I can't stop talking. They can say, my body has gone into urgency. Or, I'm ridiculous, why am I like this? They can say, this is an old collapse pattern. Or, I never change. The content is related, but the field is entirely different. One response opens space, the other closes it. And this is where psychological maturity becomes crucial. Pattern interruption must include both compassion and accuracy. Compassion without accuracy becomes indulgence, vagueness, or denial. The person never really sees what is happening. They just soothe themselves around it. Accuracy without compassion becomes internal violence. The person sees the pattern, but in a way that drives them deeper into contraction. Neither one is enough on its own. The work is to tell the truth about what is happening without turning that truth into a form of self-destruction. That is harder than it sounds, because many people were taught that the only way to change is through pressure, through criticism, through being hard on themselves, through refusing softness, because softness was confused with weakness, laziness, or collapse. But if the original loop was formed inside environments of pressure, shame, fear, contempt, or emotional misattunement, then using those same energies to interrupt it usually just reinforces the old architecture. The person may momentarily feel more controlled, but they are not more conscious. They are simply being managed by the same old internal force. A good interruption creates space. A shame response closes it. That is the core insight of this whole section. Space is what matters. Space between the trigger and the interpretation. Space between the body shift and the behavioral completion. Space between the old role and the present moment. Space between the self and the story that is rushing in. Space to notice, to name, to breathe, to choose even slightly differently. If the response to noticing creates more contraction, then the interruption has failed, even if it looked self-aware on the surface. This becomes especially important because many people secretly turn the pause itself into another performance. They notice the loop and then start trying to do awareness correctly. They become tense about being conscious. They monitor themselves too aggressively. They force themselves into calm language they do not actually feel. They produce a kind of internal theater of regulation. This is understandable, but it is still another version of control through performance. So how do you pause without turning the pause into another performance? First, by understanding that interruption does not require instant transformation. It requires contact. The pause is not there to make you look healed, wise, regulated, or spiritually advanced. It is there to stop total identification with the loop. It is there to keep the pattern from becoming the whole field. If all you manage to do is notice, breathe once, and slightly reduce the speed of completion, that already matters. Second, by using language that names the pattern without becoming the pattern. This is where practical interruption language becomes useful. It does not say the interpretation is false. It says it is currently arising inside activation, and therefore does not yet deserve unquestioned authority. I can pause before I become this fully. This one is especially good for relational loops, where the person can feel an old version of themselves coming online. The appeaser, the attacker, the withdrawer, the fixer, the performer. It reminds them that identity is not total yet. The role is emerging, but not complete. Something old is moving through me. This is one of the gentlest and most profound interruption phrases, because it creates distance without dissociation. It acknowledges history, pattern, and emotional truth without collapsing into them. It says, this matters, this is real, and it may not be wholly about the present. These phrases matter because they create internal conditions in which awareness can remain. They shift the person from total immersion to partial observation. They do not solve the whole pattern, but they interrupt inevitability. That interruption changes everything. Because once inevitability weakens, even a little, choice starts becoming imaginable again. Not a perfect choice, not total freedom, not clean mastery, but enough room that the person is no longer entirely being carried. This is especially important in relational moments. Imagine you notice the tone change in your own voice during conflict. The old urge to prove, explain, attack, or withdraw has started. Shame would say, you're doing it again, you always ruin this. A better interruption might sound like, my system is moving quickly. I don't need to complete this loop right now. Or, this is activation, not yet clarity. That pause may last 3 seconds. It may not prevent all reactivity, but it may stop the whole conversation from becoming pure pattern. Or imagine the collapse loop. The person wakes into heaviness, dread, and futility. Shame says, here we go again, you'll never change. A better interruption might be, something old is moving through me. Or, this is a pattern beginning, not the whole truth. That may not instantly lift the state, but it can stop the person from building an entire day on top of it, as though the state were total reality. Or imagine digital compulsion. The hand moves toward the phone. The body wants relief, stimulation, escape, something. Shame says, you have no discipline. A better interruption might say, I do not need to complete this loop right now. Or, what is my system trying not to feel? Again, the phone may still get picked up, but the movement is no longer happening in total darkness. That matters, because the point of interruption is not to prove that you are now above the pattern. The point is to reduce how completely the pattern can become you. This is why compassion is not weakness here. It is precision. Compassion says, I am trying to see clearly enough that I do not make things worse. Accuracy says, I am not going to pretend this is not happening. Together, they create the right kind of firmness, not punishment, but presence. Presence is what loops cannot tolerate for very long. They thrive in automaticity, speed, shame, and total identification. They weaken when seen early, named cleanly, and met without collapse into self-violence. So the practical task is not to become endlessly gentle in a sentimental sense, nor endlessly hard in a punitive one. It is to become more exact in what helps awareness stay online. A good interruption creates space, a shame response closes it. Once that is understood, the next step becomes much more usable. Now we can ask, what does this look like in daily life? In conflict, distraction, digital habits, repeated mornings, familiar relational dynamics, and all the tiny repetitions through which autopilot quietly organizes a life? That is where we move next. Part 5: Practical Awareness in Conflict, Distraction and Repetition. Up to this point, the episode has been building the architecture of recognition. We have looked at why loops feel natural from the inside, how the body often notices before language does, and why interruption fails when it collapses into shame. But now the work has to become more usable, because if awareness only lives in abstract insight, it will not survive contact with ordinary life. It has to be applicable in the moments where autopilot actually takes over, in arguments, in digital distraction, in repeated emotional climates, in familiar stories, in old relational chemistry, in the small habits that quietly consume hours and shape identities. This is where practical awareness matters. Not a dramatic awakening, not perfect self-control, not endless self-monitoring, just earlier contact in the real places where automaticity lives. One of the clearest of those places is conflict. In conflict, conflict is such a revealing environment because it shows how quickly people stop being in the present conversation and start being in an older one. On the surface, two people may be discussing something current, a misunderstood message, a boundary, a repeated household issue, a disappointment, a tone, or a decision. But often, underneath the actual topic, the nervous system has already dropped the person into a familiar role. This is the first practical skill in conflict, noticing when you are no longer in this conversation. That moment matters. Because many arguments stop being present tense long before anyone explicitly realizes it. The partner says one thing, but the body hears an older accusation. A friend sets a boundary, but the system hears rejection. A manager gives feedback, but the body hears humiliation. A child resists, but the parent system hears disrespect, loss of control, or emotional overwhelm. In each case, the present moment is still technically there, but the person has already moved into a patterned interpretive field. This is where catching the old role becomes vital. The appeaser begins trying to smooth, reassure, and reduce tension before they have even fully felt what they themselves think. The attacker sharpens and escalates because the vulnerability feels too exposed. The explainer starts producing too many words, too much context, too much defense, as though a perfect description might buy safety. The withdrawer begins leaving the room emotionally, even if the body remains present. These roles are not random personality quirks, they are patterned responses. In conflict, they often appear fast. So, one of the most practical questions is, which version of me is beginning to take over right now? Not in a self-dramatizing way, not as performance, but simply as a pattern check. Am I about to appease, attack, explain, go cold, disappear, overfunction, collapse? That question alone can interrupt a lot. Then there is tone. Tone often changes before content does. A person may still be saying something reasonable, but the field has already shifted. The voice is tighter, faster, flatter, sharper, more brittle, more distant. The body has already moved into defense. If you can hear your own tone changing, that is often one of the earliest usable signs that the loop is taking over. And the same goes for urgency. Once the conflict begins feeling like it must be resolved right now, explained right now, won right now, or escaped right now, the system is often already running a loop rather than staying with the complexity of the moment. Interpretive collapse is another clear marker. Suddenly, everything gets simplified. You never listen. You always do this. This is exactly what happens. There's no point. You don't care. I can't say anything. Binary thinking appears. Nuance leaves. The present issue becomes totalized into a whole pattern of meaning. That collapse is useful to notice, because it often signals that the body is no longer relating to the present moment with enough openness. It is protecting itself through certainty. This is where pause matters. Not avoidance. Not shutting down. Not stonewalling under the name of consciousness. But knowing when the field has narrowed so much that pushing through will likely create more loop than truth. Many people stay in conflict too long once their systems have already stopped being contactable. They keep speaking because they think stopping means failure. But sometimes the wiser move is to say, my system is moving too quickly. Or I want to continue this, but not from this state. Or I need 5 minutes before I become this fully. A good pause is not escape. It is protection for the part of the conversation that still deserves reality. In distraction, another place autopilot thrives is distraction, especially digital distraction. This is one of the most normalized forms of automaticity in modern life, which makes it easy to underestimate. People often imagine autopilot only in emotionally dramatic moments, but much of it lives in the tiny repeated movements through which attention leaks away. The hand reaches for the phone, the app opens, the feed scrolls, the message gets checked, the email refreshes, the mind says it is just for a moment, and then 15 minutes, 40 minutes, or 2 hours are gone. What matters practically is not only the aftermath, but the moment just before the movement completes. Can you catch the instant you reach for stimulation? Can you notice the urge before the phone is already open, and the mind is already dispersed? That is often the real training ground. Because digital loops are not only about entertainment or a lack of discipline. Very often they are about regulation. The person reaches because presence feels difficult. A task feels boring, confronting, undefined, emotionally loaded, or cognitively demanding. Silence opens. Loneliness appears. Uncertainty becomes noticeable. The mind wants noise. The body wants movement. Stimulation becomes relief. This is why noticing why you want the noise matters. Not in a complicated psychoanalytic way every time, but in a simple, immediate way. What do I not want to feel right now? What just changed? What became difficult enough that my hand moved? What state am I trying to exit? Sometimes the answer will be obvious. Boredom, shame, uncertainty, emotional flatness, low-grade dread, social checking. Sometimes the answer will be less clear, but even asking the question interrupts the sense that distraction is neutral. And once the loop has begun, recognizing digital loops before they swallow time becomes another key skill. There is often a point early in the spiral where consciousness can still re-enter. The body knows it has crossed from, I'm checking one thing, into I'm no longer here. The eyes feel different. Time loosens. Attention fragments. The person is now moving through symbols, reactions, updates, arguments, emotional triggers, and borrowed urgency without any stable center. If caught early enough, that can still be interrupted. Not always by heroic self-control. Sometimes simply by naming it. I've gone into stimulation. I'm dispersing. This is not rest. This is escape. Doom scrolling is one of the strongest examples because it combines emotional activation with attentional helplessness. The person is not only consuming information, they are being drawn through repeated cues of danger, outrage, urgency, scandal, identity threat, or symbolic conflict. Their body becomes more activated while their awareness becomes less sovereign. They may feel informed, but what is often happening is saturation. The system becomes more externally shaped and less internally located. Checking messages compulsively works similarly. On the surface, it seems small, but it often reflects a loop around uncertainty, validation, fear of missing something, fear of being forgotten, need for control, or low-grade relational vigilance. A person may tell themselves they are just staying responsive, but in reality, the loop is regulating anxiety through repeated checking. Noticing that distinction matters. And there is also the quieter problem: losing hours to symbolic conflict, reading arguments that do not belong to your life directly, entering debates that leave you more inflamed than informed, staying inside reaction cycles because the emotional charge keeps the system engaged. This is one of the modern ways autopilot quietly colonizes a life, not through dramatic disaster, but through constant low-level attentional capture. Scattered attention becomes a form of autopilot because it removes contact with the present without looking like collapse. The person is active, reactive, stimulated, and yet strangely absent from themselves. They are living in fragments. In repetition, autopilot also lives in repetition. The repeated emotional climates, repeated stories, repeated routines, repeated relational collapses that become so familiar they stop looking like loops at all. Recurring mornings are a powerful example. Some people wake into the same emotional weather again and again. Not always because the world is the same each day, but because the body has learned a morning state: dread, pressure, numbness, urgency, heaviness, low-grade shame, anticipatory defense. If this goes unnoticed, the person may keep mistaking the recurring climate for a fresh truth about the day. Practical awareness asks, is this morning state familiar? Am I waking into a loop before I've actually met today? Then there are repeated stories about the self. I always do this. I'm the one who can't cope. I'm difficult. I'm too much. No one really gets me. I always end up alone. I can't handle pressure. I'm just this kind of person. These stories may contain real fragments of experience, but when they become repetitive enough, they often stop being fresh perception and start being organizing loops. The person sees through them, lives through them, anticipates through them. Practical awareness does not require denying them automatically. It asks, is this a living truth or a familiar narrative groove? The same applies to repeated emotional grooves. Some people know the route too well. Irritation into defensiveness, shame into collapse, loneliness into compulsion, uncertainty into overthinking, relational distance into protest, boredom into stimulation, conflict into role. Once you know your emotional grooves, you start seeing that autopilot is not always dramatic. It is often the same small turn taken again and again. And this is why re-entering old relational chemistry even after insight can be so disorienting. A person may know full well that a particular dynamic is unhealthy, immature, destabilizing, or simply familiar in painful ways. Yet when they encounter the same tone, same energy, same kind of person, same kind of unpredictability, the body starts moving. The chemistry returns, the role returns, the fascination returns, the collapse returns. This is not because the insight was false. It is because the pattern remains active and body-based. Awareness has to learn to catch the chemistry as chemistry, not mistake it for destiny. That is where the practicality of this whole section lands. Autopilot is not only dramatic. It lives in tiny repetitions that quietly organize a life. It lives in the recurring morning state, in the same tone change during conflict, in the hand moving toward the phone, in the same story spoken about the self, in the quick urge to fix, in the fast slide into checking out, in the familiar spiral through symbolic conflict, in the old chemistry that still lights up the body, in the repeated emotional groove that starts before thought fully arrives. The reason this matters is simple. The earlier these repetitions are seen, the less total they become. You may still enter them. You may still act out some of them. You may still lose time to them. But you are no longer entirely unconscious inside them. That is the beginning of reclaiming a Part 6 awareness checks as a real-time practice. If the previous parts have shown how loops begin and how they can be interrupted without shame, then this part turns that understanding into something even more usable: awareness checks. Not as rigid self-monitoring, not as obsessive inner surveillance, not as another way of becoming tense around your own mind, but as moments of conscious re-entry. That distinction matters. Many people hear something like this and immediately turn it into a control project. They imagine they now need to monitor every feeling, every thought, every shift in tone, every bodily sensation, every urge, every reaction. But that usually just creates a more sophisticated form of contraction. It turns awareness into pressure. The point is not to become hyper self-conscious. The point is to create small openings in real time, so that the pattern does not get to run the whole sequence uninterrupted. That is what an awareness check is: a brief return, a moment of contact, a small interruption in the automatic flow, a chance to ask, what is happening right now, before the loop finishes telling you who you are, what this means, and what you must do next. The questions themselves can be very simple. What is happening in my body right now? This is often the best place to begin, because the body usually knows before the mind explains. Is the jaw tight? Is the breath shallow? Is the stomach hard? Have the shoulders lifted? Has the body gone flat, urgent, braced, foggy, cold? That question brings you back to the level where the loop first begins organizing itself. What just changed? This is especially useful because loops often begin with a shift. A message arrives, a tone changes, a memory appears, a silence lands differently, an app opens, a thought enters, a person says one sentence, and suddenly the field is not the same. If you can catch the moment of change, you are often much closer to the beginning of the loop than if you wait until it is fully underway. What am I believing in this moment? Not as a philosophical exercise, but as a quick reality check. What story has just become emotionally convincing? I'm in trouble. They're angry. I've failed. I need to fix this now. No one cares. This always happens. Sometimes the belief is not fully verbal yet, but even asking the question starts bringing it into the light. What am I about to do automatically? That one is extremely practical. Reach for the phone. Send the message. Explain too much. Shut down. Leave the room. Apologize too quickly. Scroll. React. Defend. So much of autopilot lives in what the body is about to do before reflection has fully entered. Is this present reality or old patterning? This question does not deny the present. It widens it. It reminds you that a real event may still be passing through old architecture. The current conversation may matter, but the intensity of your reaction may also be carrying history. What state am I in? Not what do I think about this situation? Not what conclusion have I already reached, but what state is organizing my perception? Fear? Shame? Collapse? Urgency? Defensiveness? Numbness? Overactivation? That question often changes the whole quality of the moment. What would a 5-second pause change? Not an hour, not a retreat, not a complete transformation. 5 seconds. What would happen if you did not complete the reaction immediately? That small amount of space can be enough to weaken the inevitability of the loop. These checks become especially useful in ordinary places. In the car, after a conversation that has stirred something, before you carry the whole state into the next place, before replying to a message that has activated urgency, anger, shame, or over-explaining, during a difficult conversation, when you notice your tone changing or the old role coming online, when waking, before the morning mood becomes the unquestioned truth of the whole day, before opening an app, when the hand is already moving, and the body wants stimulation more than contact, when feeling suddenly certain, ashamed, urgent, or flat, and wanting to act from that feeling as though it were clarity. These are not dramatic practices. That is part of their power. They are small enough to be real. And that is the key point. Awareness checks are not about becoming impressive. They are about becoming interruptible. They help you return to yourself in the middle of ordinary life, where loops usually win by being faster than reflection. So the practice is simple, not constant monitoring, but repeated re-entry. A brief question, a small pause, a little more contact, enough awareness to stop the pattern from having the whole field without being seen. Once those checks become more natural, something important begins to happen. Real-time noticing changes your relationship to the loop itself. Even when the pattern still appears, it no longer runs in total darkness. That is where we move next. Part 7. What real-time noticing changes at this point? It is important to answer a very practical question. Why does all this matter if the pattern still happens anyway? Because many people hear this kind of work and quietly think, yes, but if I still react, still scroll, still collapse, still over-explain, still go numb, then what has really changed? And that question deserves an honest answer. Real-time noticing does not eliminate patterns instantly. It does not mean that the first time you see the loop disappears. It does not mean you become immune to your own history, immune to activation, or immune to the speed of the nervous system. What it does is more subtle, but no less important. It changes your relationship to the loop. That is the beginning of freedom. When a pattern runs in total darkness, it feels inevitable. It feels like reality, like identity, like this is just what happens. The person is inside it without distance. The reaction completes itself, and only later, sometimes much later, do they realize what took place. In that state, there is very little room. The loop is not just happening to them, it is being them for that period of time. Recognition weakens inevitability. That is the first major shift. The moment you notice, even briefly, this is happening, something changes in the structure of the experience. The pattern may still be active. The body may still be moving. The argument may continue. The hand may still reach for the phone. The old story may still be forming. But it is no longer running with quite the same total authority. It has been seen, and being seen changes what it is. Noticing creates friction inside the loop. That friction matters. Before awareness, the pattern runs like a groove with no interruption, stimulus, reaction, completion. But once awareness enters, even for a few seconds, the groove stops feeling perfectly smooth. There is resistance now, not the resistance of suppression, but the resistance of observation. Something in you is no longer moving at the same speed as the loop. Something is tracking it, witnessing it, naming it, feeling it happen in real time. That friction may seem small, but it is often the beginning of profound change, because even if the pattern still runs, it no longer runs in total darkness. This is such an important point that it is worth slowing down for. Many people dismiss early awareness because they expect change to feel dramatic. But dramatic change is often the visible result of much subtler shifts repeated over time. The first few times a person catches the loop, they may still complete it almost entirely. They still send the message, still react defensively, still lose an hour to scrolling, still collapse into the old morning mood, still become the appeaser, the attacker, the withdrawer, the performer. But if they saw it while it was happening, something is already different. They are no longer fully identical with it. That is the core insight of this section. You may not stop the loop the first time you see it, but you stop being fully identical with it. That is not a small thing, because identity is one of the main ways patterns keep their power. If the person experiences the loop as simply me, then there is no meaningful gap in which another response could emerge. But if the person begins to experience the loop as something occurring in them, something familiar, something active but not total, then the relationship changes. They are no longer only the pattern, they are also the ones who can recognize it, repeatedly noticing trains returning earlier. This is how change becomes real. The first time, maybe you notice after the argument. The second time, halfway through. The third time, as your tone changes. The fourth time, when your chest tightens before the sentence even leaves your mouth. That is progress, not glamorous progress, not social media ready progress, but real progress. The system is being trained toward earlier awareness, and earlier awareness means more usable space. The same is true in distraction. Perhaps at first you notice the digital loop after an hour, then after 20 minutes, then after 5. Then, in the instant your hand moves toward the phone. That is not trivial. You are reclaiming time, attention, and presence not by force, but by becoming more interruptible. Reclaiming a few seconds can prevent hours of autopilot. That is another truth people underestimate because they are waiting for larger victories. But often, in a few seconds, is exactly where a life starts reorganizing. 5 seconds before the reply. 5 seconds before the defensive sentence. 5 seconds before opening the app. 5 seconds before saying yes automatically. 5 seconds before disappearing into collapse or urgency. Those seconds contain more possibilities than people realize because they interrupt momentum before it becomes identity again. This is where hope becomes more grounded. Not because the pattern is gone, not because the work is finished, but because the person is no longer condemned to live the loop with zero awareness. They are developing a different kind of participation, more conscious, more embodied, more honest, more able to return. It is important, though, to hold the nuance carefully. Real-time noticing is not instant transcendence. Some patterns are old. Some are bound up with attachment, trauma, shame, chronic stress, or years of repetition. They may not loosen quickly. They may return many times. They may still overpower awareness in certain states. That does not mean the noticing is failing. It means the work is real. Because real work often looks like this: seeing it sooner, naming it more gently, interrupting it slightly earlier, losing less time inside it, recovering more quickly after it, and slowly becoming less fused with the version of you it tries to reinstall. That is what matters. So the value of real-time noticing is not perfection. It is a relation. It changes how you stand in relation to your own automaticity. It introduces witnessing where there was only repetition. It introduces friction where there was only inevitability. It introduces return where there was only unconscious completion. And once that is understood, one final humane truth has to be added. Because even with all this awareness, old patterns still return. They recur, they relapse, they revisit. And unless that reality is understood properly, people often turn one bad day, one old loop, or one familiar collapse into proof that they have failed. That is where we move next. Part 8: Relapse, Repetition, and Returning Again. At this stage in the episode, one final difficulty has to be faced honestly. Because without it, everything we have said so far can easily become another perfection project. Another subtle demand to do awareness properly. Another reason for people to feel inadequate is when an old pattern returns. And old patterns do return. They return even after insight, even after good therapy, even after deep reflection, even after periods of real growth, even after months of doing better, even when a person genuinely understands themselves far more clearly than they once did. That is not failure. It is reality. One of the great misunderstandings in consciousness work is the fantasy of linear progress. People imagine that once something has been seen clearly enough, it should no longer come back. Once the person understands the childhood wound, the relational pattern, the nervous system sequence, the trigger, the emotional groove, or the loop of thought, they assume the work should now move in a clean upward line. Less repetition, less collapse, less return of the old material, and when life does not obey that fantasy, they often conclude that they have failed. But consciousness does not work like a staircase. It works more like a field with seasons, tides, thresholds, and recurrences. Patterns return not always because nothing changed, but because life keeps presenting new states, new pressures, new relationships, new layers of the same old material, and new opportunities to meet an old sequence with a different kind of awareness. That is why relapse into familiar loops is normal. A person can know exactly what their old shutdown looks like and still shut down during a season of exhaustion. A person can recognize their attachment pattern and still re-enter it when the right chemistry, tone, or fear cue appears. A person can have months of steadier mornings and then find themselves waking into the old emotional weather again under strain, grief, uncertainty, or accumulated stress. A person can be far less compulsive with digital distraction and then suddenly lose 3 evenings in a row to scrolling because presence became harder to bear for a few days. None of that automatically cancels the work. The real question is not whether the pattern ever returns. The real question is, what is different when it does? That is where the difference between I failed and this pattern is still active becomes crucial. I failed turns a recurrence into an identity verdict. It compresses the whole event into self-judgment. It often carries shame, hopelessness, and the subtle belief that a returning pattern proves that nothing meaningful has changed. Once that interpretation takes hold, the person tends to lose more ground than the original recurrence required. They are no longer just dealing with the returning loop. They are now also dealing with a collapse around the return of the loop. This pattern is still active, says something much more precise. It does not deny disappointment. It does not pretend that recurrence is irrelevant, but it frames the event as information rather than self-condemnation. The pattern is not gone. It still has pathways. It still becomes available under certain conditions. That may be humbling, but it is workable. It keeps the person in relationship with reality rather than in theatrical defeat. This matters because many people lose the most ground not when the old loop returns, but when they interpret the return as proof that they are back at the beginning. But they are usually not back at the beginning. If they had noticed sooner, they would not have been at the beginning. If they recovered faster, they are not at the beginning. If they named the pattern with less shame, they are not at the beginning. If they lost 1 hour instead of 1 week, they would not be at the beginning. If they can feel what state the pattern arrived through, they are not at the beginning. If they are less identical with it than before, they are not at the beginning. This is why expecting linear progress makes people unnecessarily cruel to themselves. It teaches them to read normal recurrence as total regression. It sets up an impossible standard in which consciousness must look like continuous improvement without reactivation, repetition, setback, fatigue, or old chemistry. But human beings are not machines upgrading in a straight line. They are living systems, and living systems revisit old material under new conditions. Sometimes a pattern returns because life is currently asking more of the person than they can metabolize with their present capacity. Sometimes it returns because a deeper layer is surfacing. Sometimes it returns because the person is tired, or lonely, or triggered, or in love, or frightened, or under social pressure, or back in a family field, or in a new context that resembles an old one in ways they did not notice immediately. Recurrence is not always proof of failure. It is often proof that the work is ongoing, and conscious living means exactly that, ongoing, not a permanent escape, not final victory, not a version of self that never gets caught again, but repeated return. That phrase, repeated return, may be one of the most mature ways to understand the whole project, because what does conscious living actually look like in a real human life? It looks like noticing again, coming back again, re-entering the body again, interrupting the loop a little sooner again, telling the truth more gently again, recognizing that the old adaptation is active again, choosing not to turn recurrence into identity again, refusing to disappear entirely even when the pattern is familiar enough to feel like home again. That is not glamorous, but it is real. Often, it is far more transformative than the fantasy of sudden permanent freedom. There is also something deeply stabilizing in accepting the cyclical nature of this work. When people stop demanding final victory, they often become more available to actual practice. They stop wasting energy trying to prove they are beyond pattern. They stop turning every return into a catastrophe. They become less fragile in the face of recurrence, because recurrence no longer means the whole structure has failed. It simply means the path of return is needed again. This does not make the work passive. It makes it more honest. It says, yes, I may meet this again. Yes, the old route may still open. Yes, some conditions still make this sequence likely. But that does not mean I am condemned to live it unconsciously. It means the practice is alive. And that is the core insight of this section. Recovery from autopilot is cyclical. The practice is a return, not a final victory. That insight protects the work from two extremes. On one side, despair, I failed, so none of this matters. On the other side, grandiosity, I've solved this now, so I am done. Both are distortions. The more grounded path is humbler. You learn the pattern. You lose yourself. You notice. You come back. You lose yourself again in a subtler way. You noticed earlier. You return. Over time, something changes, not because the pattern never appears, but because your relationship to it is no longer helpless. And that leads us naturally to the final movement of the episode. Because if the work is not total control and not a perfect escape, then what is it? What are we actually reclaiming in all of this? The answer is simple, but not small. We are reclaiming the moment before the loop hardens completely. The moment before the reaction becomes total. The moment where awareness protects the part of us that would otherwise disappear into repetition. That is where we move next. Part 9, Integration. Reclaiming the moment before it hardens. By this point, the real shape of the work should be clearer. The aim is not to control every state. It is not to become someone who never reacts, never drifts, never repeats, never gets pulled into the old story, never loses time, never feels shame, never goes urgent, never vanishes into performance, never reaches for the familiar escape. That fantasy is one of the quickest ways to turn consciousness into another punishing ideal. The real work is much more human than that. It is in noticing earlier. That is where reclamation actually begins. Not at the end of the loop, once the damage is done, and the day has already been shaped by it. Not only in the post-mortem, when the mind looks back and says, I see what happened. The deeper work is in finding the moment before reaction becomes total. The moment before the old tone fully takes over. Before the scroll becomes an hour. Before the argument becomes a pattern instead of a conversation. Before the morning mood becomes the truth of the day. Before the familiar self appears and starts calling itself reality. That is what it means to reclaim yourself. Not to become someone else, but to return before the loop hardens completely. Because once the loop hardens, it starts speaking for you. It decides what this means. It tells you who the other person is. It tells you who you are. It tells you what must happen next. It makes urgency feel like necessity, shame feel like truth, collapse feel like identity, and repetition feel like fate. In that state, awareness is not absent entirely, but it is often too far behind to do much more than witness the completion. The earlier the noticing, the more possible the interruption. That sentence is simple, but it changes the whole practice. It means small moments matter, tiny shifts matter, breath matters, tone matters, the hand moving toward the phone matters, the first tightening in the stomach matters, the first interpretive collapse matters, the first urge to prove, flee, fix, explain, numb, or disappear matters. Because if those moments are seen while they are still small, the field remains more open. The pattern is not yet total. There is still more of you available. And that is one of the deepest functions of awareness. It protects the part of you that would otherwise disappear into the loop. Not by force, not by perfection, not by winning some heroic battle against yourself, but by staying close enough to the beginning that the old pattern cannot become the whole world without being seen. This changes how you understand progress. Progress is not only measured by whether the loop ever comes back. It is measured by how soon you can recognize it, how fully you become it, how long it runs, how much it colonizes the day, and how gently you can return from it. That is what makes conscious living real, rather than theatrical. So the practical questions at the end of this episode are worth carrying with you, not as abstract reflections, but as live points of inquiry. What is the earliest sign of your autopilot? Is it in the jaw, the stomach, the tone, the speed of your thoughts, the reach for stimulation, the collapse of curiosity, the old sentence returning? When do you vanish most quickly? In conflict? In loneliness? In the mornings? Online? In silence? In shame? In urgency? Around certain people? In particular rooms? What phrase could help you interrupt your most common loop? Not perfectly, not like a script, but what words create enough space for you to re-enter? This is activation, not yet clarity. Something old is moving through me. I do not need to complete this loop right now. My system is moving quickly. What moment in your day is asking for more awareness right now? The first 10 minutes after waking? The pause before replying? The moment before opening an app? The shift in your voice during conflict? The evening hour when you most often disappear? That is where practice lives. Not in grand declarations, but in repeated return to the places where automaticity quietly takes over. This episode has brought the series into practical territory. We've looked at what autopilot really is, why insight alone does not stop repetition, why recognition is harder than it sounds, how loops begin in the body before they become language, why interruption fails when it collapses into shame, and how repeated noticing changes your relationship to the pattern, even before the pattern fully loosens. We followed autopilot through conflict, distraction, recurring mornings, old relational chemistry, compulsive checking, emotional grooves, and the tiny repetitions through which a life is often organized. And if there is one thing to carry forward from all of this, it is this. The work is not under the control of every state. It is in noticing sooner. It is in reclaiming the moment before reaction becomes total. It is in staying close enough to your own experience that the old loop cannot fully become your identity without meeting some awareness on the way through. But once autopilot is noticed, another question naturally follows. How do you stabilize enough to stay present? Because awareness alone is not always enough if the nervous system is already overwhelmed. Recognition matters, but it needs support. It needs capacity. It needs regulation. It needs rhythms of return strong enough that consciousness can remain more available under pressure. And that is where the final episode of this series turns. In episode 20, The Discipline of Conscious Living, we'll explore what it means to move beyond insight into practice, not as perfection, not as performance, but as repeated return to body, awareness, language, truthfulness, and steadier forms of presence. So for now, don't ask whether you've conquered the pattern. Ask whether you are learning to see it earlier. Ask whether you are a little less identical with it than before. Ask whether you can feel the moment where awareness begins to return, because often, that moment is the beginning of everything. So to close this episode, I leave you with this. Stay near the signal, Stay honest in the pause, and I'll meet you where attention becomes choice. Until next time, you've been listening to the Consciousness Code Podcast, episode 19, Reclaiming Yourself from Autopilot. I'm James Miller.